legitimate questions that are being grappled with, or is this just about political blockage?
I mean, that would be a legitimate question, but unfortunately that's not what's being raised, except way at the margins. What's being raised is the opposite. We're not doing enough. We're not militant enough. We're not violent enough. Mm-hmm. There's almost no broad protest against the global assassination campaign, unfortunately. It's outrageous. It actually undercuts principles of Anglo-American law that go back to the 13th century.
Does President Barack Obama have a moral compass? And if he does, is he ignoring it at his own peril, at the country's peril?
That's an interesting question. During the last election, I happened to be talking to a well-known black activist, very much involved in civil rights and other activism, and he told me a story. He said that after Obama's first election, 2008, he was visited by a group of African-American women leading activists who wanted to talk to him. He said he was there when they came out of the meeting and asked them what it was like. And their answer was, this man has no moral center. That's their reaction. I think they're right. If you look at his policies, I think that's what they reveal. I mean, there's some nice rhetoric here and there, but you look at the actual policies, they're pretty shocking. The drone assassination campaign, it's a perfect good example. I mean, it's just a global assassination campaign.
Were his efforts to try to keep Israel from expanding settlements
in the West Bank?
He didn't make the effort.
He said a couple of words.
Token effort?
There was no effort. I mean, just look at his predecessors. Say George Bush the First. I mean, when Israel was that first Bush administration, they didn't really oppose the expansion of settlements, but they were opposed to the brazen, offensive way in which it was being done. So when, say, Secretary of State Baker would land in Jerusalem, the Prime Minister Shamir would announce that day, we're putting up a new settlement. Well, you know, patrician American elites don't like to be insulted to their face. So the Bush administration actually imposed penalties. Did Obama do anything? No, he just said, it's not helpful. Mm-hmm. And then at the Security Council, February 2011, there was actually a resolution which was calling for implementation of official U.S. policy. Obama vetoed it. What does that tell you? He's telling Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders, I'll tap you on the wrist, but go ahead and do what you like. And in fact, during the settlement freeze, take a look at what happened. It didn't stop. Construction continued in East Jerusalem. Projects that were started were continued. There were all sorts of exceptions. And the U.S. did nothing. So, in fact, Obama is actually the first president who hasn't really imposed restrictions on Israel. There's one interesting case right now. It's the case of what's called E1. There's this corridor between the town of Ma'ale Adumim and Greater Jerusalem, which for 20 years Israel's been wanting to build there. That would complete the virtual bisection of the West Bank.
Without it, there could be no contiguous Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, actually there can't be anyway, but
right.
with this, it kind of ends it. Every American president has blocked it. And in fact, what Israel's had to do is sort of find devious ways around it, like putting up a police station or something, but they haven't been able to develop it. Now they've announced that they're going to develop it. Obama's reaction and Hillary Clinton was, it wouldn't be helpful. In other words, we're not going to do anything about it. Well, and in fact the U.S. continues to support it, provides the economic aid, military aid, diplomatic support, and so on that allows it to continue. Israeli leaders can see that. They don't care about a statement saying it's not helpful. Fine, it's not helpful, okay. So it's just the opposite. They've been unusually soft on Israel. In fact, just not every president has blocked things, including the second George Bush, not Obama. And in fact, if you look back at his record, it's not surprising. I actually wrote about this before the 2008 primaries, just looking at his webpage, self-advertising, and it was pretty striking. There's this big section on the Middle East, and it's almost all about love for Israel. There's probably nothing about Palestinians. Maybe they should have some rights or something. But what was interesting was Lebanon. This was, remember, right after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And he describes with pride the fact that he co-sponsored a Senate resolution calling on the executive not to do anything to hamper the Israeli invasion, and furthermore to punish Syria and Iran if they tried to impede it. I don't have to describe to you what the invasion was like. That's what he was boasting about. What can you expect?
One quick final point on the media, something very close to my heart. We're coming into the U.S., and it has, for lack of a better phrase, upset some people. What is it about sources of information, about language, that makes people think that they have to try to control it?
They don't like what it says. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, why doesn't anyone report the fact that there's a very straightforward way to deal with what's alleged to be the gravest threat to peace in the world? Well, I don't want to hear that. And that's pretty normal. In the case of Al Jazeera, there's something else as well. There's a background of anti-Muslim racism, which is quite deep, and that's part of it. And it is deep. Actually, one of the funniest press conferences I've ever read about, it was partially recorded, was a couple of years ago under the Bush administration. The Emir of Qatar came to Washington, and Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, tried to urge him to call off Al Jazeera. He didn't like the things they were reporting. And the Emir, I suppose, with a sense of humor or something, gave a press conference in which he sort of gave a mocking speech in which he informed the press about this thing called freedom of the press, and how he wasn't going to interfere, and so on and so forth. Barely reported. It must have been pretty funny. I wish I'd been there. But there's a double, and it's true that Al Jazeera, you could read about, say, the bombing of Lebanon. You could see the bombing of Lebanon, the bombing of Gaza, things happening in Iraq on Al Jazeera, which you couldn't see here. Literally couldn't see them. Because I think at the time, Al Jazeera had two small cable stations that were running it. One of them in Michigan, where there's a big Arab population, and one somewhere up in northern New Hampshire or something. But basically you couldn't see it, unless you went to the internet, and nobody knows to do that. And now they picked up a cable station, and as you say, there's protests, small cable outlet, because you got to control information. And that's been understood for a long time. In fact, it's quite striking that there are industries devoted to controlling attitudes and opinions, very specific, explicitly. It's called the public relations industry. You take a look at its founding, its documents, and so on. The goal is control attitudes and opinion. And it's quite striking that the industry developed in the freest countries in the world. It developed in England and the United States about a century ago. And they were the countries that, plenty of restrictions, but they were the most free countries. And the business world and the conservative elements understood very well that it's getting harder to control people by force. In the British Conservative Party, it's hard to control people by force. They're getting too many rights. Parliamentary Labour parties.
We are interrupting our programming now to go to some breaking news out of Egypt. And Egypt's former leader, Hosni Mubarak, has won a retrial. The 30-year president appealed against his life sentence. He was found guilty in June of conspiracy in the killing of protesters during the revolution in 2011. Rabia Rage is live for us in Cairo. And Rabia, can you elaborate on this verdict for us?
Well, the court today, the appeals court, which is one of the highest courts in the country, has decided to accept both the appeals of Hosni Mubarak and the other co-defendants, but also accept the appeals of the prosecutors. Remember, in this same trial, Hosni Mubarak, his sons, one of his close friends and his aides, an interior minister, were being tried on multiple charges, including commissioning the attacks on protesters, as well as other corruption charges. He was cleared previously on these corruption charges, but handed a life sentence for failing to act or to do anything to stop the killing of protesters. Today, his appeal in the trial in the killing of the protesters is accepted, but also the prosecutor's appeal against his acquittal on corruption charges has been accepted. And none of this is particularly a surprise. This court is known to be one of the top and best courts in the country. It is very meticulous and goes through every single detail in previous trials, and almost always tends to throw out previous convictions on technicality grounds and offer defendants a retrial.